the feather, and the sword, a Kemetic analysis of the Insurrection Act and the enduring struggle for American civil rights. Introduction: The Scales of Justice, Ma'at, Isfet, and the American Soul. To comprehend the precarious state of civil rights within the United States, one must look beyond the immediate legal and political frameworks and seek a more profound philosophical lens. The ancient Kemetic civilization of Egypt provides such a lens through its central organizing principle, the cosmic and social dialectic between Ma'at and Isfet. This framework offers not merely an analogy but a sophisticated analytical tool for dissecting the soul of a nation, revealing the deep-seated tensions that animate its history. Ma'at is a concept of extraordinary depth, representing the divine and fundamental order established at the moment of creation. It is a holistic principle that encompasses truth, balance, order, harmony, law, morality, and justice. Ma'at is not a static set of rules, but the very spirit in which justice is applied, governing the cycles of the seasons, the movements of the stars, and the proper conduct of human beings in their relationships with family, community, and the divine. It is what Jan Assmann terms connective justice, a sacred web of reciprocity and responsibility that binds the cosmos, the state, and the individual into a harmonious whole. The legitimacy of the ruler, the pharaoh, was predicated entirely on his ability to be a lord of Ma'at, one who could conceive of this divine order in his heart and decree it with his mouth, thereby ensuring the prosperity and stability of the nation. The ideological and cosmic opposite of Ma'at is Isfet. Isfet is injustice, chaos, violence, falsehood, and the will to do evil. It is not a passive void or the mere absence of order. It is an active, malevolent force that constantly threatens to unravel the fabric of creation. The rise of Isfet signifies the decay of humanity, the failure of the harvest, the breakdown of social cohesion, and the separation of the world from the divine order. It is the state of being that results when lies are promoted over truth and disunity is favored over unity. The central thesis of this analysis is that the history of the United States, particularly in relation to its citizens of African descent, is best understood as a relentless and foundational struggle between the forces striving to establish Ma'at and the deeply entrenched systems of Isfet. Within this epic conflict, the Insurrection Act of 1807 emerges as a unique and powerful instrument, a double-edged sword. Its text is dangerously ambiguous, allowing it to be wielded with immense, almost unchecked executive power. Depending on the heart and intent of the wielder, this sword can be used either to violently enforce the chaos of an unjust status quo to serve Isfet, or to carve a path for the restoration of true constitutional and cosmic justice, thereby serving Ma'at. A crucial element of Kemetic philosophy is the understanding that Ma'at is not a passive or self-sustaining condition. It requires constant and vigorous maintenance. The mythology of Kemet holds that the creator god Ra established order only after setting his daughter Ma'at in place of Isfet. This was an initial divine act of overcoming chaos. This act became the eternal duty of the ruler. The pharaoh's primary responsibility was to achieve Ma'at by actively destroying Isfet. His sacred task was to put Ma'at in place of injustice. This reframes the entire concept of justice. It is not a state to be passively admired, but a dynamic condition that must be continually fought for and defended against the perpetual encroachment of chaos and evil. This proactive vision of justice provides a powerful standard by which to judge both the American state and the movements that have challenged it. The civil rights movement, from this perspective, was not a disruption of law and order, but a profound attempt to establish true order, Ma'at, in the face of a society founded upon and sustained by state-sanctioned chaos, Isfet. Consequently, any analysis of the Insurrection Act must ask a fundamental question. Was its power invoked to actively dismantle injustice, or was it used to protect the very systems of Isfet that masqueraded as the natural order? The history of the United States, when viewed through the Kemetic lens, is not a story of a nation that has occasionally strayed from its founding ideals. Rather, it is the story of a nation founded upon a principle of Isfet, a state of profound imbalance and injustice that has been systematically maintained through legal structures, state-sanctioned terror, and federal sabotage for centuries. This enduring reign of Isfet is the essential context for understanding the dual potential of any tool of federal power, including the Insurrection Act, the foundational Isfet of slavery, and the Constitution. The American experiment began not in a state of Ma'at, but in a state of constitutionalized chaos. The nation's founding documents, while proclaiming universal rights, simultaneously protected and institutionalized chattel slavery. The Constitution denied the inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness to millions of enslaved Africans, explicitly sanctioning the importation of enslaved persons until 1808 and mandating the return of those who escaped its horrors. This was not a minor contradiction. It was the foundational principle of the new republic's economic and social order. It established a nation fundamentally out of balance, a society where the Creator's declaration, "I made every man like his fellow," was a blasphemy. This legal framework, which treated human beings as property and enshrined racial hierarchy as law, was the ultimate manifestation of Isfet, a system of institutionalized violence, lies, and injustice that stood in direct opposition to cosmic and social harmony. The Isfet of Jim Crow and state-sanctioned terror. Following the brief promise of Reconstruction, the forces of Isfet reasserted themselves with terrifying force. The era of Jim Crow codified a comprehensive system of racial oppression through a labyrinth of state and local laws designed to enforce segregation and deny black citizens their basic rights. African Americans were banned from associating with whites in schools, hospitals, restaurants, and public transportation. They were systematically deprived of decent jobs and the right to vote through discriminatory tactics like literacy tests and poll taxes. This legal architecture of Isfet was enforced by a regime of constant state-sanctioned terror, white intimidation and violence, including the omnipresent threat of lynching, mob attacks, and church bombings, served as the brutal enforcement mechanism of this unjust order. This violence was not the work of a few rogue actors. It was a systemic tool, often carried out with the active complicity or deliberate indifference of local and state law enforcement. The legal system itself developed mechanisms to protect this reign of terror. The state action doctrine, for example, became a crucial tool for proponents of discrimination, who argued that many forms of segregation were the product of private choices and therefore shielded from constitutional review. This legal fiction created an artificial distinction between public and private injustice, a concept entirely alien to the holistic principles of Ma'at, where the actions of all individuals and institutions contribute to the overall balance or imbalance of the nation. The Jim Crow South was a society wholly consumed by Isfet, where the state itself was the primary agent of chaos, violence, and injustice. The Isfet of federal sabotage, COINTELPRO, and the War on Black Liberation. The reign of Isfet was not confined to the former Confederacy or the actions of local officials. At the height of the civil rights movement, the federal government itself became a primary agent of chaos, actively working to sabotage the very movements that sought to restore Ma'at. The FBI's counterintelligence program, or COINTELPRO, stands as one of the most chilling examples of this federal embrace of Isfet. Launched in 1956 and expanded in the 1960s, COINTELPRO's explicit goal was to expose, disrupt, misdirect, discredit, or otherwise neutralize Black liberation movements and their leaders. Organizations like the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, and the Black Panther Party, BPP, and leaders such as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. were subjected to intense surveillance, harassment, and infiltration. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover's declaration that the Black Panther Party was the greatest threat to the internal security of the country was not a statement about national security in any genuine sense. It was a confession that the BPP, with its demands for self-determination and an end to police brutality, represented a profound threat to the established racial hierarchy, the reigning order of ISFET. The tactics employed by the FBI were the very definition of ISFETic actions. The Bureau used surveillance to uncover personal information to blackmail leaders, sent anonymous letters to incite violence between activist groups, used informants to spread disinformation and sow paranoia, and engaged in perjury and police harassment. In the most extreme cases, the FBI was directly involved in the assassinations of activists like Fred Hampton. These were not the actions of a government seeking to maintain order. They were the actions of a state apparatus deploying lies, chaos, and violence to suppress a quest for truth and justice. COINTELPRO was the federal government's covert war to protect ISFET from the encroaching light of Ma'at. The historical record reveals that American systemic racism is not merely a series of disconnected discriminatory acts but a coherent, self-perpetuating system of ISFET. Each component works in concert to maintain a state of imbalance. The legal framework of Jim Crow established the rules of segregation. Economic exploitation, which the Black Panther Party identified as robbery by the capitalists, ensured a state of perpetual poverty and powerlessness. Police brutality served as the violent day-to-day enforcement arm of this unjust order. When movements arose to challenge this system, whether through the nonviolent philosophy of Dr. King or the armed self-defense of the Black Panthers, the federal government's intelligence apparatus was deployed to destroy them. This creates a vicious closed loop. The system of ISFET generates the conditions that make protest inevitable, and then it uses that very protest as the justification for further and more brutal repression. This is the nature of a self-sustaining system of chaos, a malevolent anti-order that actively resists any attempt to introduce the balance, truth, and justice of Ma'at. Part 2, The Forging of the Sword, An Anatomy of the Insurrection Act of 1807. The Insurrection Act of 1807 is a law forged in the anxieties of a young republic, a legal instrument of immense and terrifying power. It represents the state's ultimate recourse to domestic force, a suspension of the normal barriers between military and civilian life. An examination of its origins, text, and evolution reveals that the act is not inherently an instrument of justice or tyranny. Instead, it is a tool, a sword whose moral character is defined not by its design, but by the purpose for which it is unsheathed, origins, and constitutional basis. The Act's legislative lineage traces back to the earliest days of the United States, born from the constitutional powers granted to Congress and the President to manage internal threats. The Constitution empowers Congress to provide for calling forth the militia, to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions. The Insurrection Act of 1807 was a direct legislative expression of this power, prompted in part by President Thomas Jefferson's need to confront the alleged conspiracy of his former Vice President Aaron Burr, who was suspected of attempting to raise a private army to carve out a new nation in the West. This law stands as the primary statutory exception to the Posse Comitatus Act of 1878, a cornerstone of American civil-military relations that generally prohibits the use of the U.S. military for domestic law enforcement purposes. The existence of the Insurrection Act as an exception underscores the gravity of its invocation. It is a legal mechanism designed for moments when the ordinary course of judicial proceedings is deemed insufficient to uphold the authority of the United States. It is in effect the legal switch that allows the president to bring the full might of the nation's armed forces to bear on its own soil against its own people. The ambiguity of power, analyzing the text. The true power and peril of the Insurrection Act lies in the profound ambiguity of its text, now codified in Title 10 of the United States Code, sections 251 through 255. A close reading of its key provisions reveals a disturbing lack of precision, granting the president enormous discretion. The act allows for the deployment of the military to suppress any insurrection, domestic violence, unlawful combination, or conspiracy. These critical terms, insurrection, combination, conspiracy, are left dangerously undefined. This vagueness effectively empowers the president to be the sole arbiter of when a domestic crisis has escalated to a point that warrants military intervention. What constitutes an unlawful combination that makes it impracticable to enforce the laws? Is it an armed rebellion, a widespread riot, a series of organized labor strikes, or a peaceful but disruptive protest movement? The statute provides no clear guidance, leaving the decision almost entirely to the subjective judgment of the executive. This statutory ambiguity is the central feature that transforms the act into a double-edged sword, capable of being used for starkly opposing ends. The 1871 Amendment, Forging the Sword for Mott. A pivotal moment in the Act's history came during Reconstruction with the passage of the Third Enforcement Act of 1871. This amendment was a direct and necessary response to the reign of Isfet being waged across the South by the Ku Klux Klan. The Klan was a terrorist organization engaged in a campaign of violence and intimidation to overthrow Republican state governments and prevent African Americans from exercising their newly won civil and political rights. State and local authorities were often complicit, either unable or unwilling to protect black citizens. The 1871 Amendment explicitly reforged the sword of the Insurrection Act, giving it a clear, ma'atic purpose. It added language, now found in Section 253, that empowers the president to use federal troops when any insurrection, domestic violence, unlawful combination, or conspiracy deprives a class of people of their constitutional rights and privileges, and the constituted authorities of that state are unable, fail, or refuse to protect that right. This was a revolutionary shift. For the first time, the act was explicitly framed not just as a tool to protect federal authority or aid a state government, but as a federal guarantee to protect the rights of citizens from the failure or refusal of their own state governments. It gave the president the clear authority to intervene on behalf of justice and equality, to use the sword to dismantle state-level systems of ISFET and enforce the principles of the 14th Amendment. The legal architecture of the Insurrection Act, defined by its broad discretion and the concentration of decision-making power in the executive, creates a unique test of presidential character. The Supreme Court's 1827 ruling in Martin versus Mott solidified this reality by declaring that the president's decision on whether an exigency exists that requires military intervention belongs exclusively to the president, and his decision is conclusive upon all other persons. While later jurisprudence has suggested some theoretical limits, the core discretionary power remains firmly with the president. This legal reality means that the invocation of the act is less a matter of objective legal interpretation and more a direct reflection of a president's moral and political worldview. In Kemetic terms, the decision to invoke the act is a weighing of the heart for the executive branch itself. The pharaoh's legitimacy as the Lord of Ma'at stemmed from his ability to perceive divine justice and enact it in the world. The Insurrection Act, by its very design, forces an American president into a quasi-pharaonic role. Their personal judgment, their conception of order and justice, determines whether the state's ultimate power will be used to suppress dissent in the name of a false, unjust peace, or to confront entrenched injustice in the name of a true constitutional harmony. The act, therefore, does not simply resolve a crisis, it reveals the moral core of the leader who wields it. Part 3. The Weighing of the Heart, Historical Invocations of the Insurrection Act. The history of the Insurrection Act is a chronicle of its dual nature. It has been invoked to crush the aspirations of the oppressed and to protect the vulnerable from oppression. Each invocation serves as a case study in the weighing of the heart of the American executive, revealing whether the immense power of the state was aligned with the forces of Ma'at or the perpetuation of Isfet. By applying this Kemetic framework, a clear pattern emerges, distinguishing between the use of the sword to enforce an unjust order and its use as an instrument for restoring constitutional justice. Etusinde o Otehundrede o Enotredive, Andrew Jackson, Nat Turner's slave rebellion in Virginia. To suppress the rebellion and restore order, enforcing Isfet used federal power to violently uphold the ultimate injustice of chattel slavery. Negative, reinforced the system of slavery and the suppression of black liberation. 1871, Ulysses S. Grant, Ku Klux Klan terrorism in South Carolina. To suppress the KKK and enforce the 14th Amendment, upholding Ma'at used federal power to protect black citizens from organized terror when the state refused to. Positive, directly protected the civil rights of African Americans and asserted federal authority to enforce equality. Late 19th, early 20th century, various labor strikes and disputes. To quell unrest and protect property, enforcing Isfet, deployed military force to break strikes, siding with capital over labor, and enforcing economic imbalance. Negative, suppressed the rights of workers to organize and advocate for just conditions. 1957, Dwight D. Eisenhower, Little Rock desegregation crisis. To enforce federal court orders to desegregate Central High School, upholding Ma'at, confronted state-level defiance of constitutional law to protect the rights of black students. Positive, a landmark moment in enforcing desegregation and affirming federal supremacy in civil rights matters. 1962-63, John F. Kennedy. Integration of University of Mississippi and Alabama schools. To enforce federal court orders for integration against state resistance, upholding Ma'at continued the precedent of using federal force to dismantle the legal architecture of segregation. Positive, enforced the constitutional right to equal education against violent state-supported opposition. 1965, Lyndon B. Johnson, Selma to Montgomery marches. To protect civil rights marchers from state and local police violence, upholding Ma'at proactively used federal power to shield the act of protest and the agents of justice from harm. Positive, protected the fundamental right to protest for civil rights and enabled a pivotal moment in the movement. 1992, George H.W. Bush, Los Angeles riots. To restore order following riots sparked by the acquittal of police officers in the Rodney King beating. Ambiguous, leaning Isfet. Restored superficial order but failed to address the underlying Isfet of police brutality and systemic injustice that caused the uprising. Neutral, negative, addressed the symptom, Riyadh, without confronting the disease injust, thereby reinforcing the cycle of unrest and suppression. The sword in service of Isfet, reinforcing an unjust order. On numerous occasions, the Insurrection Act has been invoked not to challenge injustice, but to reinforce it. Actually, in these instances, the definition of insurrection was twisted to mean any challenge to an established order, no matter how inequitable that order might be. The military was deployed to restore a peace that was, in reality, the quiet of subjugation. The most egregious examples involve the defense of slavery and the suppression of labor. When President Andrew Jackson invoked the act in 1831 to help crush Nat Turner's slave rebellion, he was using the ultimate power of the federal government to violently maintain the ultimate isvet of human bondage. The order being restored was the chaos of a system that treated people as property. Similarly, throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, presidents repeatedly used the act to intervene in labor disputes, almost invariably on the side of employers. By deploying federal troops to break strikes, the government was not acting as a neutral arbiter, but as the enforcer of an economic isvet, protecting the interests of capital over the basic rights and well-being of working people. The 1992 invocation during the Los Angeles riots presents a more complex, but ultimately revealing, case. The riots were an explosion of rage and despair following the acquittal of police officers who had been videotaped brutally beating Rodney King. The uprising was a direct response to decades of police brutality, economic neglect, and systemic racism, a society saturated with isvet. While President George H.W. Bush's deployment of federal troops did quell the immediate violence, it did so without addressing the profound injustices that had ignited the city. The intervention restored a superficial order, but left the underlying conditions of isvet untouched. From a Kemetic perspective, this was a failure to achieve ma'at. It addressed the symptom, the riot, while leaving the disease, the systemic injustice, to fester, thereby perpetuating the cycle of chaos and suppression. The sword as an instrument of ma'at, restoring constitutional justice. In stark contrast, the most celebrated and consequential invocations of the Insurrection Act occurred when presidents wielded it as a tool to dismantle state-level systems of isvet and enforce the principles of constitutional justice. These moments represent the act being used for its highest ma'atic purpose. The first and perhaps purest example came in 1871 when President Ulysses S. Grant, empowered by the newly amended act, sent federal troops to South Carolina to crush the Ku Klux Klan. This was a direct federal assault on organized domestic terrorism, an intervention made necessary by the state's refusal to protect its black citizens. Grant acted decisively to put mate in place of injustice, using the sword to restore a semblance of balance and protect the most vulnerable. This precedent lay dormant for decades until it was revived during the crucible of the Civil Rights Movement in 1957, when Governor Orval Faubus of Arkansas used the National Guard to block 9 black students from entering the newly desegregated Little Rock Central High School. He was openly placing his state in a posture of rebellion against the constitutional order of the United States. President Dwight D. Eisenhower's response, federalizing the Arkansas National Guard and deploying the 101st Airborne Division to escort the students to class, was a landmark act of enforcing ma'at. It was a direct and powerful confrontation between federal law, representing the pursuit of justice, and state-level isvet, representing the violent defense of segregation. Presidents John F. Kennedy and Lyndon B. Johnson followed this precedent. Kennedy invoked the act to enforce the integration of the University of Mississippi in 1962 and public schools in Alabama in 1963, again using federal force to overcome violent, state-supported resistance to constitutional law. Johnson's invocation in 1965 to protect the marchers from Selma to Montgomery was particularly significant. He acted unilaterally against the wishes of Alabama's governor, not merely to enforce a court order, but to proactively shield the very act of petitioning for justice. He used the sword to protect the agents of Ma'at from the predictable violence of an aesthetic state, ensuring that the call for justice could be heard. In these pivotal moments, the Insurrection Act became what its 1,871 authors had intended, a federal sword of justice, capable of cutting through the thicket of states' rights arguments to restore the fundamental balance of the Constitution. Part IV, Restoring Balance, a Kemetic Reckoning for the 21st Century. The long and fraught history of the Insurrection Act, viewed through the clarifying lens of Kemetic philosophy, offers profound lessons for the contemporary United States. The act is more than a piece of legislation. It is a national barometer, a sensitive instrument that measures the moral alignment of the nation's leadership and its wavering commitment to its own highest ideals. Its terrifying duality, its capacity for both liberation and oppression, forces a reckoning not just with the law itself, but with the foundational character of the American Republic. The act as a national barometer. The story of the Insurrection Act is the story of America's internal conflict. When the nation's executive leadership has been aligned with the principles of Ma'at, with truth, justice, and the constitutional promise of equality, the act has served as a righteous tool of liberation. It was the sword that broke the Klan's terror in South Carolina and shattered the gates of segregated schools in the South. In these moments, the president, acting as a lord of Ma'at, used the ultimate power of the state to confront chaos and restore a just balance. Conversely, when the nation's leadership has been aligned with the preservation of an unjust status quo, with the economic and racial hierarchies of Isfet, the act has been a tool of brutal oppression. It was the sword that crushed slave rebellions and broke the backs of striking workers. The law itself did not change, the heart of the one who wielded it did. This reveals the act's true function. It is a mirror that reflects the moral condition of the executive branch and, by extension, the nation itself. The failure of Western legalism versus the wisdom of Ma'at. This analysis highlights a fundamental divergence between the ancient Kemetic worldview and the modern Western legal tradition. Western jurisprudence often prioritizes procedural correctness, creating a system where legality can become detached from substantive justice. This is evident in the legal chicanery of the state action doctrine, which for decades provided a shield for the systemic isfet of Jim Crow by creating an artificial public-private distinction. It is also evident in the legalistic framework that allowed a program like COINTELPRO to operate using the color of law to wage a war against those seeking justice. Ma'at, in contrast, demands a holistic, connective justice, where law, morality, and cosmic balance are inseparable. In a Ma'atic system, a law cannot be just if it produces an unjust outcome. The entire social and cosmic order is the ultimate measure of righteousness. A law as potent and ambiguous as the Insurrection Act is profoundly dangerous in a legal system that lacks this foundational commitment to substantive justice. In such a system, the concept of order can easily be conflated with the mere absence of dissent, and the power to suppress insurrection can be used to protect an aesthetic peace at the expense of Ma'atic justice. The Western legal tradition provides the sword, but it is the wisdom of Ma'at that provides the scales needed to weigh the justice of its use. A call for Ma'at, not just reform. In light of its potential for abuse, there are compelling pragmatic calls to reform the Insurrection Act. These proposals rightly seek to narrow the president's vast discretion by clarifying the criteria for its invocation, imposing time limits on its use without congressional approval, and providing for streamlined judicial review. Such reforms are necessary and wise from a procedural standpoint. However, from a Kemetic perspective, these procedural safeguards are ultimately insufficient. They are attempts to modify the sword, but they do not address the heart of the one who wields it. The true danger of the Insurrection Act lies not in its flawed text, but in its existence within a nation that has yet to fully reckon with its foundational isfet. The centuries of systemic oppression, state-sanctioned violence, and federal sabotage are not aberrations. They are a core part of the nation's character. As long as this remains true, any tool of immense power will carry with it the immense risk of being used to perpetuate injustice. The ultimate protection against the misuse of the sword is not to blunt its edge, but to ensure the heart of the one who wields it is as light as the feather of Ma'at. This cannot be achieved through legislative reform alone. It requires a profound and painful societal transformation, a national reckoning with the history of Isfet, a collective commitment to dismantle its modern manifestations, and a shared dedication to building a society truly grounded in the principles of truth, justice, balance, and harmony for all its citizens. The challenge is not simply to reform a law, but to restore the soul of a nation. This has been a Sherry Plaza presentation.